before we came online, you were telling me that, because I was saying to you that you wrote a beautiful synopsis of the Ukraine war, which I tweeted about. I didn't want to talk to you today about the Ukraine because I've done so many shows on it that I think the listeners are going to get tired of it. And your take on the war is basically identical to mine. But you wrote this very, very, really useful synopsis that then you published on your website, and I tweeted, and it kind of had the whole setup about the provocations that led up to the war, and how the principal doyens, the most respected graybeards of American foreign policy in both political parties, George Kennan, who was the architect of the containment policy, Bill Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, who threatened to resign because he saw that we were provoking the Russians by moving NATO so close. And then Bill Burns, who was the ambassador to Russia, who said this, you can't.
And is now the CIA director, after all. And he wrote that memo in 2008.
And he said, you are going to provoke the Russians to war. This is a line that you can't be crossed. The title of his email was "Niet means niet." You are crossing red lines here and then you go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was kind of the figurehead of the neocon movement, who, after we made the promises in 1991 and 1992, in exchange for Russia moving all of its troops out of East Germany and us unifying East Germany under NATO, and saying promising we won't move NATO 1 inch to the east. And then Brzezinski publishes this plan in 1997 that lays out the rollout about how we're going to encircle Russia with NATO. And all these guys, the most respected people, are saying you can't do that. You got to stop treating Russia like an enemy, or she's going to become an enemy. It's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you're going to provoke her. This before Putin was in there. They were saying this. So you laid it out perfectly in this. And you and I were talking, and you told me that you had I said, it's kind of a perfect editorial length. It's about 800 words, right? And you said, yeah, I wrote it for the New York Times, and that's the length the Times asked you to do, 750 to 800. You said that you gave it the Times, and you went in and argued with their editorial board, and they didn't want to hear you. And I've had those kind of arguments with them on other issues, where it's just like talking to a wall. And they're, respectful, but, it's like the words bounce off of them. They're impervious to logic, to reason, to facts, to anything. It's really extraordinary, because these are some of the most intelligent, thoughtful people in the world, supposedly, and yet logic has no impact on them. They're armored against it. And you said that then they said, well, you can do an op-ed. So you did the op-ed, and they edit it, they screw with it, as they always did. And then, at the last minute, they tell you, no, we're not going to go with it.
No, but the funny thing, by the way, I did the op-ed. It was accepted. We did some edits. I thought the edits were fine. They sent it back in the New York Times font. So that's the stage we were at. We were at the stage where you press the button and it goes into the paper. So it was all there. And then I felt pretty good, And in fact, I have to say my family was amazed. They're going to run your thing? And I said, yeah, we really talked. They disagreed, but they're going to run it. And then the last moment, when it's already in New York Times setting, the editor writes me, oh, I have bad news. Sorry, we're not going to run it. One of our regular contributors is going to say something like this. I don't want to clog the pages. So it was, whoa, that's a little weird. Like a story that relates to global survival. You couldn't run one guest essay of a few hundred words in addition after accepting it. So I said, who is it? Silence. So I looked day after day, who's this contributor that's saying that the war was provoked by NATO? Nothing like it. Nothing like it. So days go by. I write to them. I'm still searching. Who's your contributor? Because now we're, 10 days later, I don't see anything like this. And then a couple days ago, there was another unbelievably aggressive, we got to get them the F-16s, another escalation, on the road to what? To Armageddon? And so I said, oh, is that the piece? And of course they don't answer that also. It's, in other words, they just won't have a public debate. That's it. Not in their pages. That's it. They just want to feed a line, and they don't want to hear any other lines. Even for public discussion. And this is an op-ed page. It's not their policy. It's just to have a public discussion. And Bobby, I happen to know a little bit about this. I was actually an economic advisor to Gorbachev. I was an economic advisor to Yeltsin. I was an economic advisor to President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine. I was friend of President Yushchenko, the second president of independent Ukraine. I've been called to give them advice on things. I'm following this for 30 years. And I asked for 700 words. No way, because they don't want any public debate, by the way, about the obvious. And interestingly, it's quite interesting. Somebody wrote to me a couple of days ago, asked me a question. Then he wrote back again saying, by the way, Professor Sachs, I was on the Italian negotiating group in the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, which was when Bush pushed the statement by NATO that Ukraine would become a NATO member. And I know what this guy told me. He said, we were aghast. All the Europeans, the French, the Germans, the Italians, they knew this was a terrible thing. And he wrote to me a couple of days ago just to describe what I knew already in 2008, because my European friends in high positions said, what's your president doing with this provocation? So these are obvious things. Our own diplomats said it. We made commitments. The Europeans said it. But there's a silence on it in this country, even as we're heading towards more escalation, more than 100 billion already sent to this disaster, so many people losing their lives. And we don't have a public debate in our mainstream press, mainstream media, in fact.
I want to get back to the New York Times in a minute, but why do you think, Obama came in as kind of a peace president, and why do you think that that he, went along with this in 2000?
I really think, and I learned a lot by studying your uncle's administration, and wrote a book about his peace initiatives in 1963, which I think were the most important initiatives on peace in modern times, when President Kennedy negotiated the partial nuclear test ban treaty. And the thing that I really felt after a very deep dive in U.S. foreign policy making is that a president has one main job in foreign policy, and that is to keep the foot on the brakes, because this war machine is always revving. The military industrial complex is always cooking up new things. The intelligence agencies and their covert operations are always cooking up new things. And you got to keep your foot on the brake. And President Kennedy learned it after the Bay of Pigs. He saw the disaster. And, Obama had his foot on the brakes on a couple of things, but he lifted his foot off the brakes on many things also, trying to overthrow the Syrian government, a disaster, being talked into the disaster of overthrowing the Libyan government and engulfing that country in 10 years of civil war that's not over yet. And he presided over the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukrainian president. So there's a lot there. Obama did say we should negotiate with Iran, and that takes a lot of bravery in Washington, because there's a lot of forces against that. But he took his foot off the brake because I don't think he had the experience, and he didn't understand that's his real job. Stop the wars, stop the new wars, stop the covert operations. They're dangerous. Don't overthrow the Ukrainian president, for heaven's sake. And, his Secretary of State, that's another matter. She didn't feel that way. She loved all of this stuff. I just listened to her talk recently, and this is really where we're at. We've got a war machine here, and war machines want to be used. They want to bulk up. They want to try new weapons. They want to buy new armaments. They want to open new bases. And a smart president, knows to say, no, stop. You're going to get us into a lot of trouble. And Obama did know, by the way, in 2014, don't go more deeply, because he said it in an interview, and he got attacked for it. He said Russia has escalatory dominance, meaning whatever we do in Ukraine, they care a hell of a lot more about this than we do. And they will just keep escalating to not have NATO along their 2,000-kilometer border. And so whatever we start, it's not going to end well. So he said, at least don't start this. But President Biden doesn't get that. They just keep escalating step by step. They say, we're not going to do this, then they do it. We're not going to do this, then they do it. We're not going to have F-16s, then they do it. And now we have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, saying, oh, this war could go on for decades. Are you kidding? By the way, that was the first thing I wrote, and I tried to tell the Ukrainians, this is a terrible idea for you. Look at Afghanistan. That's what America does. It gets in there, war that just never ends because they don't know how to end it. And this is what's going to happen to you. And now they say these are grown-ups, supposedly. Grown-ups saying, oh, yeah, the war could go on for, instead of saying, we got to find a way to peace, which is absolutely possible. That's really the story of this thing.
You mentioned about my uncle discovering it during the Bay of Pigs, which he was very suspicious about. He didn't want to do it. He thought, why are we going in there? There were no Russians in Cuba at that time. It was just a country that had chosen a different form of government that we didn't like. But, in his view, it was not the U.S. job to go in there and correct it. It was, that was the job of the Cuban people. And they talked him into it through using a variety of subterfuges and lies. And afterward, when those men were dying on the beach, he felt so devastated by that he considered resigning. And he told that to his father. And his father said, it's the best thing that could have ever happened to you because it happened early and now you know who you're dealing with. And, he spent the next 1,000 days of his administration saying no to those guys.
And by the way, he took full responsibility for it in that famous line that success has 1,000 fathers and orphan, and failure is an orphan. And he said, "I stand here. This was my responsibility," and it was a shocking thing. And he found out, my God, he found out that there really is a lot that goes on in the U.S. war machine that is hard to control, really hard to control.